Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. A panicked voice crackles through a 911 call. Shots fired. Officer down. ... We need backup now. Sirens wail in the distance, the tension in the dispatcher's voice betraying the chaos unfolding. Grainy police radio clips pick up frantic updates as officers scramble through the dark streets of Moncton, New Brunswick. Helicopter searchlights sweep over rows of lockdown homes. Families huddle indoors, peeking through drawn blinds too afraid to sleep. In June 2014, this quiet Canadian city, known more for its railway history and peaceful suburban sprawl than for violent crime, was suddenly transformed into a zone of fear. The calm was shattered when a heavily armed 24-year-old man emerged from the shadows, dressed in camouflage, carrying rifles, and driven by a twisted resentment toward law enforcement. The scale and swiftness of the attack stunned residents and authorities alike. For nearly 30 hours, Moncton became the epicenter of one of the deadliest manhunts in modern Canadian history. What could push a young man to target police officers? In cold blood? How did he evade capture for so long, despite an enormous manhunt and the full attention of the nation? And more chillingly, what does this event reveal about the vulnerabilities even the safest communities still face? Moncton, nestled in southeastern New Brunswick, was a city that embodied small-town tranquility. With a population just over 70,000, it was a place where neighbors knew each other, where doors were often left unlocked, and where serious crime felt like a distant issue. The city had a reputation for being friendly, tight-knit, and safe, a feeling that made what happened in June 2014 all the more jarring. Into this peaceful setting entered Justin Bourque. At 24 years old, Bourque wasn't known as a troublemaker in the traditional sense. Raised in a devout Catholic family with several siblings, his early life appeared unremarkable from the outside. But beneath the surface, troubling signs had been developing for years. Friends and acquaintances described him as intelligent but increasingly withdrawn. He dropped out of high school, drifted between jobs, and began distancing himself from both family and friends. His world became smaller, more isolated, and increasingly shaped by fringe beliefs. Bourque's social media activity painted a dark picture. He regularly posted anti-government memes, conspiracy theories, and rants against police and authority. He idolized armed resistance and posted images of himself in tactical gear, brandishing weapons. His Facebook feed became an echo chamber of paranoia and resentment, filled with references to gun rights, government overreach, and apocalyptic fantasies. What might have once seemed like edgy posturing now reads like a manifesto in slow motion. Those close to him noticed his growing fascination with firearms and survivalist ideology. He spent much of his time alone in the woods, honing shooting skills and rehearsing scenarios of confrontation with authority. There were clear warning signs, conversations that veered into extremist rhetoric. It's an intense preoccupation with violence and an emotional detachment that signaled something was deeply wrong. Whether Bourque was suffering from a specific mental health condition remains unclear. But his behavior in the months leading up to the shooting reflected a toxic blend of ideological radicalization, personal disillusionment, and psychological instability. He wasn't part of an organized movement, but rather a lone individual spiraling inward, his worldview. In the evening of June 4th, 2014. The calm of Moncton was shattered in a matter of minutes. Just after 7:30 p.m., residents in the north end of the city began noticing something strange. A man in full camouflage gear walking down Pioneer Avenue carrying what appeared to be a rifle. Some thought it might be a prank or someone heading to a hunting trip, but the truth was far more sinister. By 7:40 p.m., Justin Bourque had taken up a hidden position and opened fire on unsuspecting RCMP officers, responding to calls about a suspicious individual. Without warning, he ambushed them. Within moments, a deadly and calculated attack was underway. Officers David Ross, Fabrice Gevaudan, and Douglas Larche were shot and killed in the line of duty. Two others, Eric Dubois and Darlene Gauguin, were wounded but survived. These officers weren't just badges, they were fathers, husbands, and respected members of the community. Constable Ross, a canine officer, had recently become a father. Constable Gevaudan was known for his quiet strength and kindness. Constable Larche had once received a Medal of Bravery for rescuing a drowning man. Their loss sent shockwaves through Moncton and across the country. As Bourque disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood, panic spread. A citywide lockdown was declared. Police urged residents to shelter in place, lock their doors, and stay away from windows. Schools, businesses, and public services shut down. Streets were eerily empty as the hunt began, and the normally peaceful neighborhoods turned into a surreal scene of silence and sirens. Residents described a haunting atmosphere, and many huddled in basements with their children, clutching phones and listening to news updates. Social media exploded with posts from people seeing helicopters overhead or armored vehicles rolling through their streets. The fear was palpable. No one knew where Bourque was, how heavily armed he might be, or when he would strike again. Meanwhile, the RCMP launched a full-scale emergency response. Tactical teams were flown in from across Canada. The perimeter was expanded as officers combed yards, woods, and sheds door to door. With limited information and a mobile, unpredictable shooter, the search was both urgent and dangerous. Officers moved cautiously, aware that any misstep could lead to more casualties. By the end of the night, Moncton had become the epicenter of a national tragedy. The community was stunned, grief-stricken, and gripped by a fear few had ever imagined. Possible in their own backyards? And somewhere in that quiet, locked-down city, Justin Bourque was still on the run. For more than 30 relentless hours, Moncton bore the weight of an unseen adversary. From dusk on June 4th until the afternoon of June 6th, tactical teams fanned out through backyards, wooded lots, and cul-de-sacs. Armored vehicles rumbled through silent streets as RCMP tactical response units used night vision scopes and thermal imaging to peel back darkness for any sign of movement. Canine teams trotted along fence lines, and drone footage scoured rooftops, all under the tense watch of officers plywooding windows to guard against stray bullets. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack, set hearts racing. Hospitals transformed from havens of learning and healing into ghost towns. Classrooms sat empty, playgrounds deserted, and hospital admissions were limited to emergencies only. Even ambulances approached with extra caution, headlights dimmed, sirens muted. City Hall and municipal buildings locked their doors and grocery stores locked theirs, leaving only the glow of street lamps to guide residents in hushed passage. Media helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting arcs through the night sky, while live broadcasts stitched together updates, rumors, and raw footage of heavy-set officers moving door to door. Social media became both lifeline and liability. Residents posted geotagged photos of RCMP convoys, shared screenshots of official alerts, and traded anecdotes of fleeting shadows glimpsed from second-story windows. At the same time, conspiracy theories and unverified sightings fanned the flames of panic. Amid the digital roar, a quieter, deeper fear settled into the fabric of everyday life. Families whispered in basements, clutching each other close. New parents paced hallways, torn between consoling their infants and keeping them safe. For one small city, accustomed to neighborly barbecues and weekend hockey games, the lines between safety and danger blurred, leaving an imprint that would linger long after the final arrest. In the early evening of June 6, 2014, the manhunt that had paralyzed Moncton came to a quiet, almost surreal end. At approximately 12:10 a.m., over 30 hours after the first shots were fired, Justin Bourque was spotted by a resident in a wooded area behind Wheeler Boulevard. RCMP officers quickly surrounded the location, moving in with calculated precision. He was found lying face down in the grass near a residential backyard, exhausted and unarmed. There was no final standoff, no exchange of gunfire. Bourque offered no resistance. With his arms outstretched and weapons discarded nearby, he simply said, "I'm done." Officers arrested him on the spot, bringing a calm close to the chaos he had unleashed. The moment was captured in part by police dash cams and surveillance footage, later released during court proceedings. Grainy, steady images of a young man subdued not by force but by fatigue and inevitability. As news of his capture spread, a wave of collective relief swept through Moncton. the lockdown was lifted, and residents slowly emerged from their homes, some blinking in the morning sun, others embracing neighbors for the first time in days. Vigils were held, flowers were laid outside the RCMP detachment, and people gathered in silence to honor the fallen. The tension broke, but the grief had only just begun. Psychological analysis of Bourque after his arrest painted a chilling portrait. Emotionally detached, disturbingly calm, and driven by a deep hatred of authority. He spoke in a flat, almost rehearsed tone about his motives, referencing what he saw as oppressive government forces and a belief that he was starting a rebellion. Yet he also expressed confusion and defeat, as if unsure what to do once his fantasy of violence had played out. Following his arrest, Justin Bourque was swiftly moved into the judicial system, where the seriousness of his crimes left little room for ambiguity. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of RCMP constables David Ross, Fabrice, Gevaudan, and Douglas Larche, along with 2 counts of attempted murder for wounding officers Eric Dubois and Darlene Gogun. The evidence against him was overwhelming: eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, social media activity, and Bourque's own confession. In a move that surprised some, but ultimately accelerated the legal process, Bourque pleaded guilty to all charges less than 2 months after his arrest. There was no drawn-out trial, no appeal for leniency. His admission in court was quiet, emotionless, and absolute. For the families of the victims and the traumatized Moncton community, the guilty plea brought a measure of closure, though not healing. On October 31, 2014, Bourque was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 75 years. The harshest sentence imposed in Canada since the death penalty was abolished. At just 24 years old, this meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no realistic prospect of release. The sentence was possible under changes to Canada's criminal code introduced in 2011, which allowed judges to impose consecutive parole and eligibility periods for multiple murders. Bourque became the first person in Canadian history to receive such a sentence. Justice David Smith, who handed down the ruling, called Bourque's actions one of the most horrific crimes in Canadian history and emphasized the calculated, deliberate nature of the ambush. The severity of the sentence reflected both the devastating loss inflicted on the RCMP and the profound threat Bourque had posed to public safety. The courtroom was filled with uniformed officers, survivors, and grieving families, as some wept silently. As the sentence was read, others stared ahead, unmoving. There was no outburst, no confrontation, just a heavy silence. As justice was served in the only way the law allowed, in the days that followed the capture and sentencing of Justin Bourque, Canada entered a period of national mourning. Thousands gathered in Moncton for a regimental funeral unlike any the city had ever seen. Uniformed officers from across the country and beyond stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving civilians, lining the streets in solemn tribute. Bagpipes echoed through the city as the hearses passed, draped in the Canadian flag. Prime Minister Stephen Harper attended the ceremony, standing with the families of Constables Ross, Gevaudan, and Larche, whose deaths had pierced the national conscience. Moncton, though shaken, began the long road toward healing. Memorials sprang up around the RCMP detachment flowers, handwritten notes and candles left burning through the night. A permanent monument was later established to honor the fallen. Community counseling services were flooded with requests, not just from families directly affected, but from ordinary citizens trying to process the trauma of lockdown, fear, and loss. Schools introduced support programs, and the city poured resources into restoring a sense of safety. But beyond grief came questions, many of them difficult and urgent. One of the most immediate responses was a reevaluation of RCMP policy. Watch it. The time of the attack, frontline officers in many detachments, including Moncton, were not equipped with carbines, assault-style rifles, leaving them outgunned against a shooter like Bourque. After internal review and public pressure, the RCMP accelerated plans to equip officers with more powerful weapons, increase body armor availability, and improve active shooter response training. These changes, while necessary, raised uncomfortable truths about preparedness and the cost of being unready. The shooting also reignited debate across Canada about gun control, radicalization, and mental health. Bourque had legally acquired his weapons but exploited gaps in oversight and psychological evaluation. Critics pointed to his history of disturbing social media posts and isolation as signs that were either missed or ignored. Mental health professionals, lawmakers, and police unions clashed over where the blame should fall on policy, on access to weapons, on online extremism, or on a system that failed to intervene before it was too late. For many, Bourque's attack became a tragic symbol of how modern violence can fester quietly in overlooked corners of society, fueled by ideology, detachment, and unchecked resentment. Moncton has moved forward, but the echo of those 30 hours of fear, loss, and resilience still lingers in its streets, serving as both a scar and a reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how quickly it can be stolen. The tragedy in Moncton wasn't born in a moment. It was the result of a slow, dangerous evolution that unfolded in plain sight. Justin Bourque's actions stemmed from a toxic combination of isolation, ideological extremism, emotional detachment, and an unchecked obsession with firearms and authority. The descent into violence wasn't sudden. It followed a pattern increasingly familiar in lone wolf domestic terrorism. There was no single trigger, but rather a gradual withdrawal from reality, reinforced by online echo chambers and personal disillusionment. Could this have been prevented? That's the haunting question left in the wake of such events. There were warning signs. Bourque's social media posts were filled with violent, anti-police rhetoric. He became more withdrawn, more radicalized in his thinking, and openly fantasized about resisting government control. But in Canada, where the balance between personal freedom and public safety is delicately held, no system was in place to flag his dissent until it was far too late. He didn't belong to any formal extremist group, didn't set off obvious red flags in any criminal database, and moved just under the radar like many lone attackers before him. His hatred for authority wasn't rooted in any personal encounter with police. It was ideological, shaped by a belief that law enforcement represented oppression. This kind of dehumanized worldview is a hallmark of extremist psychology, whether in militia movements, certain online forums, or radical anti-government groups. The same pattern emerges. Individuals alienated from society who begin to see violence as not only justified, but necessary. Bourque viewed himself as a soldier, in a one-man war delusion that had festered in the dark until it exploded into reality. The Moncton shooting challenged long-held assumptions in Canada about national identity, safety, and vulnerability. It exposed a need to better recognize early indicators of radicalization and psychological decline, not just through surveillance, but through meaningful community engagement and mental health support. As tragic as this case was, it also offers hard-earned lessons about the dangers of unchecked ideology and the urgent need to bridge the gap between individual suffering and public protection. Bourque's rampage was not just an act of violence, it was a failure of recognition, intervention, and understanding. Soft, ambient piano music begins. Slow fadine, over footage of candlelight vigils, Moncton skyline at dusk. Narrator gentle. Sincere tone, Constables David Ross, Fabrice Gevaudan, and Douglas Larche didn't just wear the badge, they lived lives of courage, service, and compassion. Their loss is felt not just in Moncton, but across an entire nation. Visual black and white portraits of each officer with names and years of service beneath. Narrator: we honor them not by remembering how they died, but by ensuring their sacrifice is never forgotten. Pause. Background music softens slightly. Narrator: if you ever notice someone showing signs of deep isolation, radical beliefs, or emotional instability, don't ignore it. Sometimes, a quiet conversation or a call for help can change everything. Visual, text on screen, see something, say something, subtle, no alarmism. Narrator slightly more upbeat. What are your thoughts on this case? Could it have been prevented? We'd love to hear your perspective. Drop a comment below and let's talk. Visual, comment, icon, animation, clean and minimal narrator. If you found this episode meaningful, subscribe to the channel for more stories that go beyond the headlines, where we explore the human stories behind true crime. Visual, Subscribe button animation with bell icon. Fade in text. Next episode coming soon. Narrator teaser tone. In our next story, we'll look into a small town disappearance that turned into a national mystery and the shocking twist no one saw coming. Music gently fades out. Screen fades to black with closing message. In memory of the fallen, never forgotten.